2 boys, a locked tower, and then silence. No screams, no graves, no trial. Only the slow fading of their names while the rest of the kingdom looked away. Edward V was crowned by birth, but buried by betrayal. He was never seen with a sword or on a battlefield. He never ruled. But his death, or disappearance, still hangs over England like a bad omen carved into stone. This wasn't a fall from power. It was a suffocation in the dark. And what happened to him inside those stone walls was worse than death. He wasn't born for tragedy. Edward of York entered the world in 1470 during one of England's most violent power struggles. But he didn't know any of that. Not at first. He was just a boy. Royal blood, sure, but still a child who laughed, played, and leaned close when his mother whispered bedtime stories about honor and duty. His father was Edward IV, tall, powerful, a king forged in war. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was clever and fiercely protective. Edward, their firstborn son, was seen as a symbol, proof that the Yorkist line was secure, that the crown wasn't just worn, it would be passed down. He was named Prince of Wales when he was just a baby. Even then, it was clear. This boy was going to be king someday. His tutors were handpicked. His every lesson was shaped with one goal: prepare him to rule. Latin, politics, religion, swordplay. He learned to sit still when he wanted to run. He learned to speak with grace when he barely understood the words, and he tried. God, he tried. He wasn't wild. He wasn't spoiled. Reports from the time say he was bright, serious, a boy who carried the weight of the future on his tiny shoulders. By age 10, he already knew more about ruling than most men twice his age. And yet, he didn't really have a childhood. There were no years spent running through forests, no freedom to be foolish. Every move was measured. Every word is monitored. Because he wasn't just a boy. He was a crown in waiting. But what no one told him, what no one could tell him, is that the crown doesn't protect you. It makes you a target. His father's reign wasn't peaceful. There were always rivals, always enemies. The Wars of the Roses had left blood on every throne and dagger behind every smile. Even family couldn't be trusted, especially family. But Edward didn't know that yet. To him, the world was still a place where kings were strong and sons followed proudly behind. He believed his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, loved him. He believed the royal court would rally behind him. He believed, like every innocent does, that the future was his for the taking. At age 12, he stood on the edge of that future. His father was still king. His destiny was still bright. He had no idea that the road ahead led to a stone room, a locked door, and a silence so deep it would swallow his name from history. He was a prince, a son, a boy, and in just a few months, he would become one of England's most chilling mysteries. But right here, right now, he was still safe, still smiling, still unaware that the crown sitting on his small head would one day weigh more than any child could ever carry. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. The death of Edward IV came like a punch to the lungs. He wasn't old, he wasn't weak, but in April 1483, after a brief illness, the King of England was gone, just like that, and the 12-year-old Edward, his son, became king. The crown passed to him not through triumph, but through a sudden, gutting silence. No coronation, no parade, just messengers, papers, and grief. He was in Ludlow when it happened, far from London, far from the court. They told him his father was dead, and then they told him something else. He had to ride. Now he was king, but not really. A boy couldn't rule alone, and in his father's will, one name loomed large: Richard, Duke of Gloucester, his uncle, trusted, experienced, cold. He was named Lord Protector of the realm, the man who would guide Edward until he came of age. That sounded good on paper. A protective uncle, a guiding hand. But Richard didn't ride to meet Edward with open arms. He rode with guards. At Stony Stratford, just days into Edward's journey toward his throne, Richard made his move. He arrested Edward's companions, including his half-brother and most loyal man, and claimed they had corrupted the boy, poisoned him with bad counsel. Edward was confused, hurt, but he didn't fight. He followed his uncle to London, trusted him, and when they reached the city, Richard did what all good protectors do. He locked the boy in the Tower of London. Not as a prisoner, not at first. That was the trick. The Tower was where kings stayed before their coronation. It was tradition. That's what they told him. So he waited. He played in the garden with his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. But days passed, then weeks, and the crown never came. There was no ceremony, no scepter, no throne, only more guards, fewer visitors, and the cold truth started creeping in. The boy king wasn't waiting to be crowned. He was being erased. Outside the tower, Richard moved fast. Parliament declared Edward and his brother illegitimate, claimed their parents' marriage had never been lawful. The throne now belonged to someone else, to Richard, King Richard III, and the boy in the tower, he was no longer a king, no longer a prince, no longer anything at all, just a child in a stone cell, slowly becoming a ghost. The Tower of London was never just a fortress, it was a messenger, a place built to hold enemies, secrets, and silence. And now it held two boys. Edward and his younger brother Richard were tucked away in its innermost walls. Guards patrolled the grounds. Servants came and went, with fewer words each day. The windows narrowed. The rooms grew colder. The food changed. There were no letters, no royal visitors, no toys, no noise. At first, they were confused. Edward still believed there had been a mistake. His uncle had promised protection, not imprisonment. The crown was waiting, he told his brother. They just had to be patient. But days became weeks. The guards stopped bowing. The servants avoided eye contact. The tower's stone walls, once just old and gray, began to close in. The silence became pressure. They weren't told what was happening. No one ever said, "Your uncle stole the throne." No one whispered, "You're not safe." But the boys weren't fools. They felt it in the air. Outside, King Richard III was building his power. He sent away those who questioned him. He silenced the ones who remembered Edward's rights. One by one, voices vanished. Inside, the boys began to vanish too. Not from life, not yet. From memory, from the world. They were no longer shown to the public. Before, when Edward was king, people came to see him. Now, no one was allowed near. People began to whisper. Had they been moved? Were they sick? Were they dead? No one knew. But some servants, quiet ones, left notes. Hints, descriptions, that the boys were still alive, that they played in the garden less and less, that Edward rarely smiled. He spent long hours staring out the window, looking for something, anything, a sign from the outside world that someone remembered him. But there was no sign. His name was no longer spoken in Parliament. His coat of arms had been removed. His father's legacy had been rewritten. He had been king for 2 months, and now the only proof of that was locked in a tower, behind heavy doors, watched by men who never spoke. Whatever happened next, Edward knew one thing. No one was coming, not his mother, not his allies, not even God. There was no rescue, only shadows, and 2 royal children slowly being forgotten by the country they were born to rule. At first, silence feels like nothing, a blank space, an empty hallway, a moment to breathe. But held long enough, it changes, it tightens. Inside the tower, silence became a weapon. No screams, no chains, no blood, just the slow disappearance of sound, comfort, and meaning. Edward had known noise his entire life. The shuffle of courtiers, His tutors' voices, the hum of court musicians, even the clanging of armor used to bring a strange kind of peace. The world had always been alive around him, but not here, not in the tower. In the beginning, he tried to keep his brother calm. They whispered jokes, traded memories, imagined how the coronation would look. Richard, the younger one, asked questions Edward didn't know how to answer. Why don't they visit anymore? Why are the guards watching us through the night? When do we go home? The answers never came. Each morning, fewer servants entered the room. Food arrived late. No messages. No faces from the court. The garden, once open for walks, was suddenly off limits. Their shoes were taken, then their books, then their games. Their world shrank. 4 stone walls, a locked door, and each other. At night, Edward sat by the window. Not because there was anything to see, but just because it was the only place that didn't feel like a grave. Sometimes he heard things, voices through the wall, a scrape, a footstep, but no one ever came in. No one ever said his name. He began to wonder if it had already happened, if the world outside had moved on, if he'd been erased. The silence started to pull on him. It wore down his thinking, stretched the hours. Every creak made him jump. Every breath felt too loud. The silence wasn't peace. It was pressure. His little brother stopped talking as much. Some days, he didn't speak at all, just stared at the ceiling and traced patterns on the bed with one finger. Edward still held on. He believed someone would intervene. His mother, maybe. The nobles loyal to his father. But each day made that hope smaller. Silence became the new law. Not a single word of comfort. Not a single explanation. Just the echo of things that used to be. And what hurt more than anything was that no one came to ask how he was. No questions. No care. He wasn't a prisoner of war. He wasn't an enemy. He was a child. A crowned child. And yet the world left him there, in the dark, without even the decency of a final sentence. They didn't have to kill him with blades. They let the silence do it slowly, hour by hour, until even his voice stopped trying to break through. While the boys sat in silence, the world outside moved without them. London was loud again, crowded. Banners changed. Coins were melted and recast. The face on them was no longer Edward's. It was Richard's. The man who had promised to protect the king now sat in his place. Crowned, celebrated, untouched. It happened fast. Richard claimed Edward and his brother were illegitimate. Parliament supported him. A group of priests and scholars, carefully selected, declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had not been valid. If that were true, then Edward V had no right to rule. But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't about legitimacy. This was about power. Richard had waited for years behind his older brother, watched as others climbed higher in court. He had blood, yes, but not enough. He had ambition, but no excuse, until Edward IV died. Then everything opened. He swept in quickly, stripped Edward's allies of their positions, arrested the strongest voices in support of the boy king, executed those who asked too many questions. And he didn't stop there. He moved against the queen, Edward's mother, drove her into sanctuary with her remaining children, isolated her, forced her to hand over young Richard, Edward's younger brother. She did it, likely believing it would save his life. It didn't. Now both princes were in the tower. Both were silent, and Richard was king. The rest of the nobles looked the other way, some out of fear, some out of exhaustion. England had seen too much war, too many claimants, too many battles fought over crowns and bloodlines. If Richard could keep the country stable, if he could prevent another civil war, then maybe silence was a fair trade. That was the thinking. Let the princes fade. Let Richard rule. One life, maybe 2, for the peace of a kingdom. And so, the kingdom moved on. Feasts were held, laws were passed, new coins minted, the court returned to its usual games. No one dared speak the names of the princes openly. Not at court, not in letters. Whispers, yes, but even those grew quiet. The only ones who still held onto the truth were few and powerless. The boys weren't dead. Not yet, but they had already been left behind. Their voices were gone from the council chambers. Their names scratched off the line of succession. A 12-year-old boy and his younger brother, born into royalty, now buried alive in a system designed to forget them. Not with swords, but with documents, with silence, with the slow rewriting of history. It didn't take a war to destroy Edward the Foul. It only took one man who wanted the crown more than he feared the consequences, and a kingdom willing to look the other way. There were no more visitors, no new clothes, no books, nothing but bare walls, hard bedding, and the same meals delivered at odd hours. And still, the boys remained inside. Edward had stopped asking why. He no longer waited at the window, no longer counted the guards. He knew now. The silence wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It was intentional. They weren't being protected. They were being buried. But the tower had a life of its own. Old walls that had seen too much. Stones that held screams, secrets, confessions. There were nights when the wind sounded like voices. Other nights when there was nothing at all. And sometimes it whispered. Footsteps that stopped before reaching the door. Keys turning in locks that never opened. Soft murmurs just outside the chamber. Not words, just the low sound of men speaking carefully, like they didn't want to be heard. Richard, the younger brother, asked once if the tower itself could talk. Edward didn't laugh. He wasn't sure anymore. There were rumors in the city that the boys were still alive, that they had been seen playing in the garden, that they had been moved to another castle. The problem was no one could prove anything. No one outside the tower knew what was true, and no one inside would speak. Even the servants who cleaned the floors or brought food came with eyes fixed downward. Not a word, not a glance. The boys were ghosts, even while they breathed. Edward sometimes heard his brother crying at night, muffled under the covers. He didn't comfort him anymore. There was nothing to say. The quiet did something else too. It twisted time. Days bled into each other. The light shifted through the narrow windows, but there were no bells, no routines. Just endless waiting. Waiting for rescue. Waiting for death. Waiting to be remembered. And the longer they waited, the more they felt themselves slipping. Not just in spirit, in memory. Edward tried to recall the court, his father's throne room, the faces of men who once swore loyalty to him. But those faces blurred, their voices faded. Their promises meant nothing now. The walls of the tower closed in tighter, and still whispers came. From below, from the halls, from behind the door. People plotting, planning, watching. The boys couldn't know what was real anymore. They had been removed from the world, but not from danger. Whatever was being prepared, it was getting closer. The whispers were no longer just outside. They were in their heads, in the room, in the silence, and soon, even that would vanish. Something changed. Not all at once, but slowly, like a candle burning down to the final inch of wick. The guards stopped rotating. The same faces stood outside the door. Always silent. Always watching. Meals grew smaller, colder. Sometimes they didn't arrive at all. The water tasted strange. The fruit was never fresh. The bread was hard enough to bruise a tooth. No books, no toys, no company. The younger prince, Richard, no longer asked questions. He barely spoke at all. Sometimes he just lay in bed, face turned toward the wall, breathing, but not present. Edward still tried. He tried to stay strong, to act like the older brother, but the silence had drained something from him. He had stopped pacing the room, stopped counting the bricks. The room was shrinking. Every night came faster than the one before. The sun would vanish without warning, swallowed by clouds and shadow. The walls turned darker, the corners colder, and night after night the boys were left alone. No one came, no one checked, no one cared. Edward sat up long after Richard slept. He listened, waited. His eyes burned. His body ached. But he was afraid to lie down, afraid to close his eyes and wake up to nothing. Or worse, not wake up at all. Some nights, he thought he heard breathing. Not his brothers. Someone else. Close. Just outside. Other nights, he swore someone had entered the room. Just for a second. Just to watch. But when he looked, the room was empty. Always empty. It became harder to tell what was real. He once dreamed of his coronation, of gold robes and a sword placed in his hands. He smiled in his sleep. But when he woke up, his face was wet. He had been crying. The dreams became darker. Not nightmares, just long, heavy scenes of silence. Sitting at a banquet with no guests. Standing in a church with no priest. Walking through the tower halls, but no one turned to see him. He wasn't dead. Not yet, but something inside him had already broken. No pain, no screams, just the quiet collapse of a boy's mind under the weight of being forgotten. He held his brother one night, just once. Richard had started shivering. Edward didn't say anything. Words were useless now. They meant nothing here. He just held him, and for the first time in weeks, they both slept through the night. Not peacefully, just completely. Like the silence had finally pulled them under. Like the world had finally let go. And soon, only the walls would remain. Then one day, nothing. The boys were gone. There was no announcement, no mourning, no explanation. One morning, the guards stood at their post. By the next, the room was empty. No furniture disturbed, no blood, no struggle, just silence where two royal children had once lived, breathed and waited. It was as if they had never been there at all. Some claimed they had been moved. Others believed they had been killed. But the truth was buried so deep, no one could pull it out without tearing the whole tower down. Not even the servants knew, or if they did, they never spoke. Rumors drifted across London like smoke. Some said it was poison. Others whispered suffocation. Some believed a pillow had been pressed down on each boy's face while they slept. Quiet, quick, final. Others told darker stories. That it was done slowly. That the orders came from someone very high up. That it wasn't just a killing. It was a warning. But none of it could be proven. No one ever saw their bodies. No coffins were carried from the tower. No graves were dug. The boys had vanished, and the silence that had tortured them in life became permanent in death. Outside the tower, England didn't stop. King Richard III continued his reign, tightening his grip on the crown. But the air was different now. People whispered in corners, looked over their shoulders. They remembered. Not officially, of course. On paper, the boys no longer existed. But in the hearts of the people, something had shifted. A line had been crossed. A king could take power. He could control parliament. He could silence dissent. But killing children, or letting them disappear, was something else. Something colder. Years later, bones would be found beneath a staircase in the tower. Small, fragile, buried in a chest. Many believed they belonged to the princes. But even then, no one could say for certain. Science couldn't prove it. History wouldn't claim it. They had become ghosts, and maybe that was worse than death. To be erased so thoroughly that even the truth became a whisper. Edward V, King of England for 2 short months, left no throne behind. No descendants. No victories. Only questions. He entered the tower as a monarch. He left it as a mystery. Just a boy, swallowed by the very castle that was supposed to protect him. And a silence that still echoes centuries later. The story of Edward V didn't end with his death. It ended with something colder. He was erased. No funeral or official notice, not even a royal edict acknowledging his absence. His name was scrubbed from official documents. His face disappeared from paintings. The royal seals with his initials were destroyed or buried. For a time, it was almost like he had never been born. The boy who had once been England's future became little more than a rumor, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, if spoken at all. Years passed. Richard III ruled, but never without a shadow hanging over him. He denied any involvement, of course. Others were blamed. The Duke of Buckingham, Sir James Tyrrell, even Henry Tudor, but none of them ever stood trial for it, and no one confessed, because the truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was control. History is written by the victors, and Edward V never had the chance to win. After Richard's death at the Battle of Bosworth, the Tudor dynasty took the throne. Henry VII married Edward's sister, Elizabeth of York, uniting the two houses and ending the Wars of the Roses. But even then, there was no justice. Henry had every reason to reveal the truth, to expose what had been done to the princes in the Tower. But he didn't. Maybe because he didn't know, or maybe because keeping the mystery alive was safer. In the years that followed, pretenders would rise. Men claiming to be one of the lost princes returned from exile. They gained followers, threatened rebellions, forced confessions, but none were ever proven to be real. They were all shadows, just like the boys had become. Today, we know Edward V's name, but only as a mystery, a tragic headline in a long, bloody chapter of royal history. He was never given a reign, never allowed to speak for himself. What we know of him comes from what others chose to write, or chose to erase. His story lives in the gaps, in the cracks between facts, in the weight of what wasn't said, and maybe that's the greatest cruelty. Not just that he died young, not just that he suffered alone, but that history moved forward without ever turning back for him. His crown was taken, his voice silenced, and his memory trapped in the same tower where his body was last seen. Forgotten, not because people didn't care, but because those in power made forgetting the only safe choice. Edward V didn't die a king. He died invisible, and in the centuries since, England has never truly answered for what happened to him. Maybe it never will. There are deaths that scream, and there are deaths that echo. Edward V's death did not come with a sword or a scaffold. It came with quiet. A silence so deep it swallowed him whole, until even the walls of the tower stopped whispering his name. He was not a tyrant. He didn't start a war. He never gave an order. All he did was exist, born to a crown he never truly wore, and for that, he vanished. Centuries later, tourists walk through the Tower of London. Guides point to windows, to stairwells, to narrow stone chambers that once held kings and traitors. Some pass the spot where two small skeletons were found, sealed in a wooden box under a staircase. The bones were reburied in Westminster Abbey, labeled simply, "The Princes in the Tower." But no one really knows. Edward V has no monument of his own. No statue, no throne, just a title he never got to claim, and a question that has never been answered. His story has become a symbol of betrayal, of ambition, of the kind of power that crushes innocence without blinking. He was a boy who trusted, who waited, who listened for footsteps that never came. And in his silence, he became something more haunting than any executed king. He became a ghost of the crown, unseen, unheard, unfinished. Generations later, kings would fall in blood, thrones would be lost in battle, monarchs would meet the axe in public squares, but none of them carried the same weight as the mystery of Edward V, because with him there was no justice, no closure, just a silence that stretched across history. It still lingers, in every mention of the Tower, in every debate about Richard III, in every whisper about royal secrets buried under stone and shadow. He should have been remembered as a young king full of promise. Instead, he's remembered as a question no one had the courage to answer, and maybe that's why his story still haunts. and in the end, silence became the loudest scream of all. If you found this story as haunting as we did, like, comment, and subscribe for more true stories that history tried to bury. And if you want more chilling stories like this one, click the next video.